Kalorama, a recorded books Highbridge imprint, presents The Tech Coup, How to Save Democracy from Silicon Valley, by Marietje Schaake, read by Lorna Bennett. Introduction. The Battle. In early 2010, at a cafe in the eastern part of Turkey, a young man, I'll call him Ali, told me of his escape from Iran. Ali had been arrested the previous summer during the Green Movement, a series of popular protests that erupted after what many Iranians regarded as a fraudulent presidential election. As Ali sat on the sidewalk with his wrists tied, anticipating being picked up by police and pondering his fate, a local woman happened to drive by. She stopped her car, courageously whisked him away, and dropped him off at home. Despite this brief reprieve, Ali knew that the Basiji, part of the infamous Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, would soon be knocking on the door of his parents' place, and he decided to flee to a remote area in the north where his family owned a small plot of land. Ali was one of millions of Iranians who challenged Mahmoud Ahmadinejad's victory in the presidential election that summer. On June 20, 2009, one of these brave demonstrators, Neda Aga Sultan, was killed by a sniper. Her death came quickly as she sank down to the pavement, blood running from her mouth, people around her screaming in horror. We know this because, unlike many of the brutal incidents that authoritarian regimes carry out in dark prison cells, Neda's death was captured on a bystander's cell phone. Videos of this and other state violence against peaceful protesters were shared around the world, fueling outrage and condemnation. Green Movement demonstrators posted their eyewitness accounts on social media with the hashtag #IranElection, allowing the entire world to witness a revolution unfolding in one of the most repressive countries on the planet. The role of social media, specifically Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, and the use of technology, cell phones and internet connections, quickly became a defining theme in how journalists and politicians around the world understood the protests in Iran. These platforms were filling an important gap left by the Iranian regime's press crackdown. A few days after the protests started, in a desperate move to regain control, authorities banned journalists from doing any street reporting. Ahmadinejad closed 12 newspapers and locked up over 100 journalists. Twitter, now known as X, emerged as the main platform for citizens to transmit information about the protests and the government's violence. As a result, some even called the Green Movement a Twitter revolution. There was a widespread sense of hope about the democratizing potential of these nascent technologies. Beyond using social media and cell phones to document and share human rights abuses, activists could also use them to coordinate actions and mobilize their movement. The administration of US President Barack Obama even asked Twitter to delay a planned systems update to avoid temporarily disabling access for protesters in Iran. This hopefulness about technology as a partner in liberation was bolstered in 2010 as popular protests erupted in Tunisia and Egypt. When Egyptians revolted against the regime of President Hosni Mubarak, Western media proclaimed it a Facebook revolution, in homage to the gigantic Facebook groups formed by youth protesters to coordinate the demonstrations. Many believed that young people in the Middle East and North Africa would be better equipped to secure justice and rights with the help of US-made technologies. While Western media and policy circles excitedly buzzed about the democratizing potential of new technologies, the picture on the ground in Cairo, Tehran, and Tunis was not as straightforward. As Iranian journalist Golnaz Esfandiari would later explain, activists typically used word of mouth, text messages, emails, and blog posts to organize protests rather than social media. Finally, as Ali himself would soon discover, cell phone technology exposed protesters to enormous risks. When he arrived at his hideout destination in the north of Iran, he called his mother to tell her he was safe. Her relief would not last long. Ali's phone signal was picked up by a nationwide monitoring network, and he was arrested soon thereafter, in the middle of nowhere. He ended up in the notorious Evin prison, known for the brutal rape and torture of inmates. After spending several dreadful months behind Evin's walls, he was able to escape during a furlough and eventually made his way to eastern Turkey. Yet even at the time of our meeting in early 2010, he still changed locations every day, since he knew that the Iranian security services were actively hunting down dissidents across the border. Those who praise the democratizing possibilities of technology and social media platforms failed to appreciate that repressive authoritarian regimes could be tech-savvy too. In Iran, and later in Syria, state authorities tactically lifted bans on the use of internet services, only to later scan posts to incriminate the messengers. The same technologies that helped detect spam assisted state militias with identifying authors of anti-regime social media posts. Military intelligence services were able to use location services to spot a group of people gathering on a street corner, real-time information that can be very useful when looking to disperse crowds before they can form. I was appalled by the suffering the Iranian protesters endured. Neda Aga Sultan was only 4 years younger than I was at the time. Their courage also deeply inspired me. I had recently won an election for a seat in the European Parliament by criticising the Dutch government, while people in Iran were being shot by theirs for doing the same. I felt shocked, not by the behaviour of these repressive governments, from whom I expected little else, but by our own double standards. The monitoring and surveillance technology these regimes were using came from Europe. Italian-made hacking systems were the technology of choice for the regime of Bashar al-Assad in Syria, while French technologies helped Muammar al-Gaddafi in Libya, and British systems facilitated the Mubarak regime in Egypt. Right when European governments were condemning the repression of people and their human rights, European companies were exporting sophisticated monitoring software to Middle Eastern rulers. As Nokia Siemens networks would admit in 2010, they sold cell phone surveillance technologies to the Iranian authorities that enabled them to track the protesters, people who were peacefully asking for freedoms that any European today takes for granted. In a hearing before the Subcommittee on Human Rights of the European Parliament, Nokia Siemens head of marketing tried to distance the company from Iran's abuses, arguing that, ultimately, people who use this technology to infringe human rights are responsible for their actions. While this is obviously true, no one disputes that the Iranian government is responsible for its actions. This does not absolve the company of its moral obligation to avoid assisting a repressive government. Engineers of companies with such contracts would have travelled to Iran multiple times to train users or to repair surveillance systems, and they likely received additional pay for staffing a hardship post. Moreover, the human rights violations in Iran were well known and well documented even before the crackdown on protests began in 2009. As a newly elected member of the European Parliament, I was incensed by Ali's story, as well as by the stories of the other Iranian refugees I met on my trip to Turkey. What meaning did European statements in support of human rights even have when global tools of repression were produced right here at home? These double standards became a galvanizing foundation for much of my work in public service. I would spend the next decade using every policy tool imaginable, trying to stop what I then called digital arms, software that inevitably violates human rights and ends up harming innocent people. Unfortunately, there is still much more work to be done. Today, newer versions of these commercial hacking systems have only grown in force and scale. Even worse, as I learned more about the sprawling digital arms trade over the past decade, I realized that Iran's Green Movement was merely one battle in the war to protect democracy from technological overreach. The reveal. When the Pegasus Project released a series of articles about government espionage, in the summer of 2021, the news filled me with a mix of horror and hope. Pegasus is the flagship spyware product of NSO Group, an Israeli technology firm that holds the pole position in the billion-dollar global spyware market. Sold as a counter-terrorism and crime-fighting solution all over the world, spyware often ends up being used like a privatized intelligence service to stalk and repress critical voices. The investigative journalists who worked as part of the Pegasus project revealed NSO Group's hit list, over 50,000 phone numbers of the potential targets that the organization had been hacking on behalf of their clients. For many, the Pegasus project displayed the deep impact of hacking and surveillance technologies for the first time. The leaks revealed the existence of highly sophisticated surveillance and hacking systems that made the tracking and tracing of Ali in Iran look wildly outdated. Pegasus can transform a target's phone or laptop into a live surveillance tool by remotely turning on microphones and cameras without the user's knowledge. These zero-click attacks, as they are known, are highly effective because the targeted individual does not even have to click on an infected link or do anything themselves for the infiltration to begin. Once NSO Group gains access, its customers can extract contacts, call logs, messages, photos, web browsing history, and settings, and they can gather information from popular communications and chat apps. Unsurprisingly, authoritarian governments across the world have been keen customers. NSO Group was valued at $2.3 billion before the Pegasus project put a critical spotlight on the company. Beyond revealing what the technology could do and who was targeted, the leaked documents also showed who was involved with NSO Group. Former officials from the Obama administration and the French government, for instance, had taken lucrative roles as senior advisors with the company, even as the phones of the President of France, the editor-in-chief of the Financial Times, and Hungarian opposition leaders were breached and monitored. Nokia Siemens's facilitation of Ali's arrest and NSO Group's ongoing dealings with autocrats beg a question. Why wasn't more being done to stop the development and sale of these technologies by democratic governments from within whose borders these companies operated? One reason, though far from the only one, is that for too long our political leaders have been in the grip of an overly optimistic and self-centered view of new technologies. The data-driven strategies that were part of the successful campaign of Barack Obama in 2008 generated off-the-charts excitement among elected officials the world over. Politicians were keen to embrace new ways to communicate with citizens and constituents. I know this firsthand because communicating on social media platforms certainly helped me win my seat to the European Parliament. As a newcomer on the political stage, I may have never reached potential voters had it not been for Facebook and Twitter. Once elected, these platforms also offered a helpful way to update people on activities that would not be reported in newspapers or TV news bulletins. In my early days in the European Parliament, technological disruption was largely seen as a positive development. But even as more information about the true nature and shadow sides of these technologies was revealed, and as companies grew massively, public officials did little. By the time the Pegasus Project revelations made headlines in 2021, I had spent a decade fighting the spyware sector, and the toxic industry still had not been brought to a halt. Yes, we managed to get the European Union, EU, to adopt export controls, restricting the overseas sales of surveillance tools, but imports, and thus domestic use, remained untouched. Naively, I initially thought that my fellow political leaders were not taking action on tech regulation because they simply didn't understand these rapidly evolving technological systems operating below the radar. Though such ignorance may have played a contributing role in their inaction, the primary reason was much more cynical. Democratic governments wanted to deploy these technologies too, to spy on their own populations. At the time, Europeans were practically apoplectic over US intelligence services snooping on European leaders, including German Chancellor Angela Merkel. The governments of EU member states pushed new legislation to protect people from falling prey to American surveillance practices. Yet despite these governments' very public outrage, their own police forces quietly procured sophisticated infiltration systems to go after criminals and terror suspects. To this day, few European government agencies will admit to using Pegasus or similar systems. Later, in 2022, additional significant cases of spyware abuse, including the hacking of opposition leaders, judges, and journalists by the governments of Greece, Poland, and Spain, were revealed. Researchers from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace created an index showing that 74 governments had contracted with commercial firms to obtain spyware or digital forensics technology. In my home country, freedom of information requests to Dutch police went unanswered, but sources told investigative journalist Hub Modokolk that Pegasus was used to hack the devices of Ridwan Taghi, the country's most notorious fugitive mafia boss. In the United States, broader awareness about mass surveillance practices of US intelligence services hardly led to decisive legal change. A decade after Edward Snowden's revelations, journalists, parliamentarians, and citizens are still barely capable of bringing transparency to the procurement of tech systems and services by democratic governments. It is a vivid reminder of how 9/11 continues to cast a long shadow over security policy, leading to disastrous moral confusion. On the one hand, there is the illusion of a clear line between democratic countries and their enemies. In the name of security, illiberal surveillance practices continue to erode civil liberties at the heart of democratic societies. On the other hand, to my frustration, the plight of human rights defenders and journalists in the global south, many of whom were first to have been targeted by Western-made spyware, generated too little urgency to address the issue. The failure of the Green Movement in Iran, as well as the lack of proper policy responses by democratic governments, made something manifestly clear during my first year in office. If technology was to serve people and promote democracy, as it promised, laws were needed to turn those hopes into realities and to guard against both corporate opportunism and authoritarian capture. Merely assuming that information and communication technology, ICT, would foster the spread of democracy was clearly a failed strategy. Defending and advancing democratic principles would require intentionally updating and creating laws to express, revive, and protect those principles from both external threats and threats within our own borders. Indeed, today's attacks on democracy do not come from just authoritarian states or a loss of trust in the democratic process. The gradual erosion of democracy in our time is being accelerated by the growing, unaccountable power of technology companies, of which NSO Group is only one, albeit extreme, example. The global shift. The unaccountable power of technology companies and the threat that they pose to democracy are by now familiar refrains. The newspapers are littered daily with scandals that cover the latest revelation of problems at one or another social media platform, search engine, or retail platform. The purpose of this book is not to preach to the choir and rehash those stories, however significant and urgent they may be. Instead, this book begins from the premise that these incidents point to systemic problems that need unpacking. The fact that our social, professional, and civil lives are increasingly digitized and, essentially, all aspects of digitization are in the hands of private companies, that certain technologies have inherently anti-democratic characteristics, while laws to protect democratic values and the rule of law are lagging, and that, most important, democratic governments' outsourcing of key functions has led to a hollowing out of government's core capabilities. These systematic problems are now undermining the core principles of democracy: free and fair elections, the rule of law, the separation of powers, a well-informed public debate, national security, and the protection of civil liberties such as freedom of expression, the presumption of innocence, and the right to privacy. Undermining principles have practical consequences, as we'll see in the coming chapters. Tech's metastatic and unchecked growth has resulted in real-world violence, instability, and division. The digital revolution has seen private companies increasingly take on functions normally assumed by states, leading to a concerning erosion of agency and accountability. For instance, Elon Musk's Starlink satellites, which dominate satellite-based internet services worldwide, have military chiefs worried, and with good reason. In the middle of the Russian war of aggression, Musk personally denied a request from Ukraine to turn on Starlink near Crimea. The Ukrainian government would need the connectivity to launch surprise attacks on Russian occupying naval vessels, but Musk decided the risk of Russian retaliation in the form of a nuclear attack was too great, a significant political decision from a businessman, and one he had the power to make. On Twitter, the billionaire bragged, "Between Tesla, Starlink and Twitter, I may have more real-time economic data in one head than anyone ever." Governments are beginning to realize that the tech sector's outsized influence is a major problem. President Joe Biden admitted as much on August 25, 2021, after inviting tech CEOs to a White House summit on cybersecurity. "The reality is," he noted, "most of our critical infrastructure is owned and operated by the private sector." The US president, arguably the most powerful leader in the world, conceded that the government alone cannot protect the homeland, and it needs tech companies to lend a hand. That private companies, rather than the government, are responsible for such basic tasks as protecting national security and gathering intelligence may not have sunk in with the general public quite yet. Without public outcry, the needed regulation, oversight and accountability are not moving along at the necessary speed. During my years in the European Parliament, I progressively came to see technology through the lens of power. Technology could help emancipate people and raise unheard voices, or it could transform disruptors into monopolists who ruthlessly pursued efficiency, surveillance, scale, and profit. In either case, technology is not neutral. As I will elaborate in this book, systems are themselves designed with values built into them, even if that is unintended. Additionally, given that most technologies are developed by private companies, these technologies are ultimately deployed for profit maximization. And profit maximization incentives are often misaligned with what is best for society. Sam Altman's WorldCoin, for example, aspires to build a global identity database by asking people in developing countries to scan their irises in return for a bit of cryptocurrency. The firm is either blind or completely cavalier to the risks of concentrating so much sensitive biometric data under one roof. Social media platforms seek to extend online engagement time of their users with little concern for the negative effect on teenagers' mental health. Tech firms and their products now also make potentially life-altering decisions. Commercial algorithms designate triage statuses in hospitals and analyze medical images. All the while, democratically elected representatives remain in the dark about key details of how these products work, since independent research is often impossible. For too long, too much trust has been placed in tech companies without making sure that their technology operates within the parameters of the rule of law and supports democratic outcomes. An abdication of responsibility on the part of democratically elected leaders is what led Pegasus being used to track members of the opposition in Poland and what enabled the Iranian government's monitoring of Ali. Laws are not updated to ensure that digital means of repression or intrusion are banned in the way that physical means would be. For instance, a conventional raid of an opposition party politician's home would immediately set off alarm bells, yet when hacking tools are deployed, there is less clarity or concern over the same kind of digital raid. The introduction of new technologies seems to blur lawmakers' vision. They cannot fathom that violations of fundamental rights, like privacy and free expression, in the digital world are just as grave, while at times they are made much more easily and can be more vast in scope. Corporate leaders and aspiring autocrats alike take advantage of this situational blindness and push the boundaries of the law. As digitization progresses, we see a gradual shift in responsibility and power away from democratic leaders. This shift accelerates two trends: growing digital authoritarianism and a wholesale decline in democratic governance. In comparison to the European and US governments, who have largely allowed private tech companies to operate as they please, the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, has made sure that new technologies serve its political system and values. It has spent the last 2 decades deploying them toward its own political advantage. The artificial intelligence, AI sector, for instance, is powered by the limitless data collected by the Chinese government, whose repressive practices are fueling innovations from facial recognition applications to new ways of influencing and controlling massive amounts of people. During the COVID-19 pandemic, tracking apps were mandatory in China and used to survey whether people stayed at home in quarantine. Similarly, the state uses sophisticated monitoring methods to verify and incarcerate the Uyghur minority population, both developing and entrenching state power. It is a model that China eagerly exports through the digital Silk Road, as well as its other development projects. By investing in infrastructure and offering cloud computing to other countries, China keeps them connected with their data and development. Egypt, for example, has relied heavily on Chinese investment to modernize its telecommunications infrastructure and even construct a new smart city. The North African country has now also adopted China's model of internet governance via a new cybercrime law, and Egyptian government officials routinely attend Beijing's censorship training. The strategic marriage of geopolitics and technology in China lays bare how far technology governance lags on the part of democratic countries, a discrepancy that not only impacts the citizens of those countries, but also affects the ability of nations to come to shared rules and solutions. It is difficult for the United States to lead the international community toward consensus on robust technology regulations, for example, given its laissez-faire approach towards Silicon Valley. China offers a cohesive top-down governance model ready to be copied. This mismatch further entrenches the agency of both corporate powers and authoritarian states. The entangled nature of technology, linking economics, security, and rights, requires an integrated political vision. Yet democratic leaders have too often responded to disruptions with inaction or a piecemeal approach, and they struggle to articulate an alternative to the technology industry's preferred hands-off approach to regulation. Without a blueprint for how to enshrine democratic standards domestically, a credible foreign policy agenda is impossible. To rein in the outsized power of technology companies, regain control over their products' basic functions, and protect democratic values on the world stage, democratic countries need to develop more robust legal and governance frameworks, effective institutions, and strong incentives that avoid abuses of power on the part of states or companies using technologies. The task: reinventing democratic governance to match the challenges of digitization will not be an easy task. Today's policy processes are running out of sync with the pace and scale of corporate operations. This mismatch is a growing problem for those who believe democracy should not be disrupted, no matter how exciting the shiny new objects from Bangalore, Shenzhen, or Silicon Valley might look. It means that democratic governance should be revived and updated. During my time in office...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?